In the dead of night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the silent farm. John and Emma, tucked inside their home, were jolted awake by the unmistakable crunch of twigs underfoot, followed by a faint, eerie whispering carried by the wind. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was out there, someone who moved with deliberate intent. Emma's heart raced as she strained her ears to listen. The shadows in the barn seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the faint glow of the moon revealed glimpses of something or someone moving among the animals. In a panic, she grabbed John's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that? We're not alone." The door creaked as it slowly pushed open, revealing nothing but a cold, empty night. But they knew they weren't alone. Chapter 1. An eclipse in a peaceful home. The sun had barely risen over the hills surrounding their small farm when John and Emma woke up to another day of peaceful routines. The sound of birds chirping outside was a familiar melody, one that had greeted them for decades. Their cozy home, tucked away at the edge of the village, seemed to be a world unto itself, where time moved slower and the worries of the outside world rarely made it past the wooden fences that surrounded their property. John was the first to rise, his old bones creaking as he got out of bed. Emma, always the lighter sleeper, stirred as well, her gray eyes squinting against the early morning light. They had long ago fallen into a rhythm, one that was as comforting as the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. John shuffled to the window, peering out to check on the animals. The cows were already grazing lazily in the pasture, the pigs snorting contentedly in their pen, and the geese waddled in a line near the pond. Emma joined him, her soft hands running through her graying hair. "Looks like another peaceful morning," Emma murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. John nodded with a grunt. "Always is, until something breaks." He chuckled, but there was a weariness in his tone. Life on the farm was hard work, and the older they got, the more the weight of it all seemed to settle on their shoulders. But for now, all was well. After a quick breakfast, they donned their boots and jackets, heading outside to tend to the animals. Emma went straight to the chickens, checking their nests and making sure they had enough feed. John walked toward the pigsty, where the pigs were rooting around in the mud. As they worked, their conversation was filled with little nothings. Plans for the garden, the weather, and the occasional memory of days gone by. It was easy to forget how much work it all took when the sun was shining, the birds were singing, and everything seemed just right. But then, as they made their way to the barn to check on the water pump, Emma's cheerful expression faded. The water pressure in the barn had always been a little finicky, but today it seemed unusually low. The faucet barely trickled, and the pump let out a strange, sputtering sound. That's odd," John muttered, bending down to inspect the pump. He turned the handle, but the sound only got worse. "It's not drawing any water." Emma stepped closer, her brow furrowing with concern. "Is it broken?" "Could be. I'll take a look at the pipes." John's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. Water was one of the most essential things they had, especially with so many animals to care for. Without it, their whole routine could fall apart in an instant. Emma looked around the barn, her thoughts racing. "We can't go without water for long, John. Not with all the animals to care for." She tried to keep her voice calm, but she couldn't shake the worry creeping up her spine. John grunted in agreement, and they both set to work trying to diagnose the problem. They checked the pump, the pipes, and the filters, but nothing seemed to work. After a frustrating hour of tinkering, John wiped his hands on his trousers and stood up, shaking his head. "It's no good. I think the pump's completely gone. We'll have to call a repairman." Emma sighed deeply, her heart sinking. A repairman wasn't exactly something they could afford easily, not with the cost of keeping the farm running. She glanced out the barn door at the animals, who had begun to notice the lack of water. The cows stood near the trough, staring expectantly, but there was nothing to give them. "Let's see if we can manage with buckets for a day or two," Emma said, though it didn't sound convincing even to her. John nodded, but his face was drawn with the stress of the situation. He knew how much work it would take to carry water by hand for all their animals, especially in the warm weather when they drank more. Before they could dwell on it further, there was another problem. As they turned to leave the barn, John noticed something strange about the pigs. They were all huddled in a corner, looking unusually lethargic. Normally, they'd be rooting around for food or mud, but today, they barely moved. Emma noticed the same thing with the geese and ducks. Something wasn't right. "John, do you see this?" Emma asked, her voice tight with concern. John walked over to the pigsty, crouching down to inspect the animals more closely. His hands brushed over their fur, and he frowned. "They don't feel right, too warm. And their eyes, something's off." Emma, her pulse quickening, moved closer to one of the geese. It was breathing heavily, its feathers ruffled and dirty. "This doesn't look normal. They're sick." A wave of dread washed over her. They had always taken good care of their animals, fed them well, kept their pens clean, and made sure they were healthy. To see them like this was terrifying. John stood up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I'll call the vet. We need to figure out what's going on." They quickly made the call, but it felt like hours before the veterinarian arrived. He was a young man, still in his 30s, and seemed eager to help, though there was a nervousness in his manner that didn't inspire much confidence. "Not sure what's causing this," he said after a brief examination. "Could be a virus or some kind of infection. I'll take some samples and send them off for testing. But in the meantime, we need to get them isolated and treat them for any possible bacterial infection." John and Emma exchanged a glance. The vet's words were vague, and they didn't know what to make of it. But they did as he instructed, isolating the sick animals in a separate pen and giving them the antibiotics he provided. As the day wore on, the situation worsened. The animals weren't improving. The pigs' condition didn't change, the geese were still breathing heavily, and even the cows were starting to show signs of distress. Emma's worry only deepened as she checked on each one, noticing the subtle changes in their behavior. Her heart ached at the thought that they might lose them all. But as nightfall approached, there was one more blow to their already fragile spirits. John, tired and frustrated, came across a pile of old equipment in the barn, something he hadn't seen in years. He dusted it off and inspected it carefully. It was an old water filtration system, one he had once used when they first moved to the farm. Could be the answer to their water problem, he thought. But as he began to set it up, he realized it wasn't as simple as he had hoped. The equipment was rusted, the hoses were cracked, and some parts were missing altogether. It was a daunting task, and John felt the weight of it pressing down on him. It seemed that nothing was going to be easy. As they sat down for dinner that night, both of them exhausted and defeated, Emma suddenly paused. The barn door was slightly open, and through the crack, she caught a strange, musty odor, one that didn't belong. "John!" Her voice trembled. "Do you smell that?" John stood up quickly, his face going pale. "That's not right. Something's wrong." As they rushed to the barn, the reality of the situation hit them hard. The animals were suffering, the water was running out, and something ominous was looming just beyond their reach. Chapter 2. Fire and Smoke. The first light of dawn was already seeping through the cracks in the barn walls when John and Emma stepped out into the cold morning air. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on them, and there was a quiet unease in the way they moved. John was the first to approach the pigs, his boots crunching in the frost as he walked towards their pen. They had hoped that overnight rest would bring some improvement, but as he looked inside, his heart sank. "Emma," he called, his voice gruff with concern. "Something's wrong." She hurried over to join him, her breath visible in the morning chill. Inside the pen, the pigs were still sluggish, their usual energetic behavior replaced by lethargy. They didn't even seem interested in the food he had set out for them. Emma bent down, reaching her hand toward one of the sows. She gently patted its back, but the pig barely acknowledged her. "They're not eating," John said softly, his worry turning to frustration. "They should be ravenous by now. They've got to be sicker than we thought." Emma stood up slowly, scanning the rest of the barnyard. "It's not just the pigs," she murmured. "The geese, the cows, they're all showing signs of something. I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." John sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We need to figure out what's causing this, and fast." The water issue was still looming over them, and as they made their way to the garden, Emma noticed the dry, cracked earth where once lush vegetables had been growing. The recent drought had already caused damage, and now, with the water pump still broken, they were under an official ban on water usage. The local authorities had issued a strict restriction on irrigation, and their efforts to water the crops by hand were only stretching them thinner. Emma looked over at John, who was already inspecting the wilting tomato plants. "We can't afford to lose this crop," she said quietly. "We need to find a way to water them." John knelt beside a row of shriveled beans, wiping the dust from the leaves. "I know, Emma, but the water just isn't there anymore. We'll have to make do with what we've got." The sense of desperation was palpable in the still air. They both knew that the harvest was the only thing that could get them through the winter. Without it, they would be in trouble. But right now, the animals were their priority. They couldn't afford to let them suffer, not when they were showing signs of a serious illness. As they stood there, contemplating their next move, a strange, acrid smell began to drift through the air. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew stronger. Emma's nose wrinkled, and she looked around, trying to identify the source. "John, do you smell that?" she asked, her voice tight. John immediately turned and rushed toward the barn. The smell was unmistakable now. Smoke. Thick, billowing smoke was pouring from the roof of one of the storage sheds. John's heart raced as he saw the flames flickering at the edges of the wooden structure. "Fire!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. Without thinking, they both sprinted toward the shed, their hearts pounding in their chests. John was the first to reach the door, but it was too late. The fire had spread too quickly, consuming the dry timber. He slammed his fist against the door, his eyes wild with fear. "Emma, the feed, the grain!" he cried, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The shed contained their entire stock of feed, everything they had worked so hard to store up for the winter. Emma grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back from the flames. "We can't go in there. It's too dangerous." John hesitated, the weight of their loss sinking in. The shed was all but destroyed now, the fire roaring with a fury that seemed to mock their desperation. The wind carried the smoke across the yard, and they both choked on the acrid fumes. As they stood there, helpless, the fire continued to rage. The grain, the hay, and everything else in the shed was being reduced to ash. John felt the ground beneath him shift, the weight of their farm crumbling bit by bit. Emma turned to him, her eyes wide with shock. "What now, John? We can't afford to lose the feed too." "I don't know," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what we're going to do anymore." The fire eventually smoldered out, but the damage was done. The shed was nearly destroyed, and the precious supplies they had worked so hard to store up were gone. It felt like everything was slipping through their fingers, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. That evening, as the sun set behind the charred remains of the shed, Emma sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She had begun to document everything, the animal symptoms, the fire, the state of the crops. She wrote down every detail, hoping that somehow it would help them make sense of the chaos that had taken over their lives. It was the only thing she could do to feel like they still had some control. John, exhausted and defeated, joined her at the table. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Emma looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "We'll keep going. We have to." The phone rang suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. John picked it up on the first ring. "John? It's your old friend, Richard." The voice on the other end said. Richard was a neighbor from a nearby town, someone John had known for years. He had always been a bit of a mystery, but they'd kept in touch over the years. "I heard about what's going on at your place," Richard continued. "I've got a few ideas that might help. I'll be there soon." John listened intently, but something about Richard's voice didn't sit right with him. There was an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. "I'll be there," John said, though the unease in his voice was clear. When the call ended, Emma looked at him, her brow furrowed. What did he say? John shook his head slowly. He thinks he can help, but I don't know. I've always been a little wary of his offers. We need all the help we can get right now, Emma said, though the same unease lingered in her voice. That night, as they lay in bed, the wind howled outside, carrying with it the stench of smoke. The fire had destroyed more than just the shed. It had taken a piece of their hope with it. As they closed their eyes, they both knew that something bigger was looming, something they couldn't yet understand. And when Richard arrived, they would have to face whatever was coming, whether they were ready or not. End of chapter 2. The barn, with its feed supplies, was almost completely destroyed, and the animals continued to deteriorate. John and Emma stood on the edge of their breaking point. Chapter 3. Secrets from the Past. The morning after the fire was a blur of smoke and confusion. The barn had been reduced to a smoldering ruin, and John and Emma had spent most of the day cleaning up what was left. But amidst the chaos, Emma's mind wandered to something else, something buried deep in her past. She had only just begun to remember it when they finished their work for the day, and as the sun began to set, she found herself standing near the ruins of the shed, lost in thought. "John," she called softly, her voice catching in the stillness of the evening. "Do you remember the old water system my parents built? The one they said was so reliable, even if the pump broke." John stopped what he was doing and walked over to her, his expression concerned. "You mean that underground water system they had here? The one that was supposed to be automatic?" Emma nodded. "Yes, that's the one. I think it's still here, hidden under the ground somewhere. My father drew up a map of it before he passed. I always thought it was just another one of his old projects, but now I think it might be the answer to our water problems." John frowned, considering her words. "But if it's underground, how do we find it now? It's been years." "I don't know," Emma admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I'm sure it's here somewhere. I remember my father talking about it sometimes, especially during the dry spells. I'll dig out the old drawings when we get inside." As they made their way back to the house for dinner, the weight of the day's events hung heavily between them. John couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control, and it wasn't just the animals or the fire, it was everything. He needed to talk to Emma about his fears. After they'd eaten, John cleared his throat and looked across the table at Emma, his face serious. "Emma, I don't know how to say this, but I'm really worried about the animals. We've tried everything, and they're still getting worse. The pigs aren't eating, the geese are barely moving, and the cows." Emma placed her hand on his, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with concern. "I know, John. I've been thinking about it too, but we're doing everything we can. We just need to stick together." "I don't know if that's enough," he muttered, staring down at his plate. "What if it's something more serious? Something we can't fix?" Emma shook her head gently. "We won't know until we try. We have to keep looking for answers." But John's worries weren't easily soothed. After dinner, as they both retreated to their separate corners of the house to rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He stared out the window, watching the last remnants of sunlight fade behind the hills, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, they began their search for the old water system. Emma dug through old boxes of papers in the attic, finally uncovering a set of faded blueprints, yellowed and brittle from age. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unrolled them, her eyes scanning the intricate lines of her father's handwriting. She recognized the marks immediately, the winding lines showing a deep well somewhere near the back of the property, hidden beneath layers of earth. "We have to find this," Emma whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "This could save us." They spent the day poring over the map, walking the property and marking spots where they thought the well might be located. By mid-afternoon, they had uncovered a series of strange markings on the ground near the back fence, just behind the barn. It was as if the earth itself had given up its secret. With shovels in hand, they began to dig. Hours passed, and the sun began to set once again, casting long shadows across the field. Just as they were about to give up for the night, John's shovel hit something hard. The sound was unmistakable. "Emma," I think we found it, John exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. Together, they cleared away the dirt, revealing an old stone well, its mouth covered by a rusted grate. It was still intact, the water level low but not completely dry. We did it, Emma whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. We actually found it. But before they could celebrate, a sudden noise broke the silence. It was a faint rustling sound, coming from the brush near the edge of the field. John immediately froze, his senses alert. They had been so focused on their discovery that they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. I'll go check, John said, his voice low. Emma nodded, her heart racing as John crept toward the noise. The rustling grew louder, and then, to their surprise, they saw one of their rabbits darting out from the bushes. It was the missing one, the one that had disappeared several days ago. Where in the world has he been? Emma said, relieved yet puzzled. But as she moved to catch the rabbit, something caught her eye, something glimmering in the sunlight. Beneath a nearby tree, half hidden by a pile of fallen leaves, was an old wooden chest. Emma's breath caught in her throat. What is that? She asked, her voice shaky. John walked over to it cautiously, his curiosity piqued. As he lifted the chest, its heavy lid creaked open, revealing a stack of old, dusty papers and a few strange objects. Emma's heart skipped a beat when she saw a small, intricately carved box inside. This looks like something from my father's collection, she murmured, picking it up carefully. The box was familiar. She had seen it before, but she couldn't remember where. The chest held more than just forgotten relics. It seemed to be a clue from the past, a secret buried for years. Emma's mind raced as she wondered what it all meant. Why had this chest been hidden here? And what did it have to do with their farm, their struggle, and the animal's mysterious illness? As they headed back to the house, their thoughts were consumed by the strange discovery. But they didn't know that their troubles were far from over. Something far more sinister was afoot, something they had yet to understand. When they returned to the house, the faintest hint of unease settled over them. The back door creaked open, and a soft gust of wind blew through the cracks. It wasn't just the wind that unsettled them, though. It was the distinct feeling that they were no longer alone. As they turned around to close the door, they noticed something strange. A set of muddy footprints leading into the house, disappearing into the shadows. End of Chapter 3. As Emma and John discovered secrets from the past and took a step closer to solving their water problem, they unknowingly stepped into a web of mystery. Someone was watching. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway caught Emma's attention as she was cleaning out the henhouse. She paused for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and squinted against the early afternoon sunlight. A car, unfamiliar to the farm, was approaching slowly. As it came to a stop, the door opened, and a young man stepped out. His crisp white coat stood in stark contrast to the dirt and dust that seemed to cling to everything on the farm. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him approach. That must be the new vet, she muttered to herself, brushing a lock of hair from her face. John, who had been repairing a fence in the back, heard the car as well and walked toward the front of the house to meet the newcomer. He didn't share Emma's hesitation but couldn't help the knot of unease that had begun to form in his stomach. It wasn't that he didn't trust new people, he did mostly, but there was something about this man that rubbed him the wrong way. "Hello, Mr. White," the young man said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Tobias Carter. I'm here to help with your animals." John studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. "I'm John. This is my wife, Emma. We're glad to have you here, though I must admit, we've had a rough time lately with the animals." Tobias smiled, his teeth white and perfect, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the farm. "I've heard. I specialize in infectious diseases, and I'll do everything I can to get your animals back on track. It's good you called for help. Not everyone does that." Emma raised an eyebrow at his confident tone but said nothing. John, however, was less inclined to take everything at face value. "Well, we've got some serious issues. The pigs, the geese, and even our cows are showing signs of something strange. And on top of all that, we've been dealing with water shortages and fires. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully, but there was something about his demeanor that struck John as overly polished. It felt more like a job interview than an effort to help. "We'll take a look at everything," Tobias said, then turned to lead them to the barn where the animals were housed. As they walked toward the barn, John's thoughts churned. He hadn't expected someone so young, so polished. In a way, it felt like Tobias wasn't just here to help. It felt as if he were here to observe, to collect data. John kept his thoughts to himself, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of illness. The cows were listless, their eyes dull, their coats looking lackluster. The pigs seemed disoriented, and the geese shuffled aimlessly about their pens. It was a scene that had become all too familiar, but it had never felt so hopeless before. Dr. Carter immediately went to the cows, running his hands along their hides and checking their gums. "Strange," he murmured. "They don't have a typical bacterial infection, but something's off. I'll need to take samples, do a culture. Could be a mutated strain, something unusual. I'll send these to the lab and see what we can find." Emma stood by, her arms crossed, trying to hide the rising fear in her chest. She watched as Tobias moved between the animals with a sense of detachment, as though they were nothing more than test subjects in a lab rather than beloved creatures that had been part of their lives for years. "Are you sure you know what you're dealing with?" she asked cautiously. "We've been to several vets already, and no one has been able to tell us what's wrong." Dr. Carter didn't seem to hear her. He was busy taking notes on a clipboard, writing down measurements, and making assessments. His voice was steady, almost mechanical. This could be something entirely new. A new strain of bacteria, maybe. "I'll keep you updated." Later that afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, disaster struck again. A shrill scream pierced the air, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She rushed to the back of the property, where the barn that housed their hay and feed was engulfed in flames. John was already on the scene, trying desperately to douse the fire with the small hose they had. But it was clear they were losing the battle. The wind was picking up, spreading the flames rapidly. "Not again," Emma whispered, her hands trembling as she grabbed a bucket of water, only to watch it evaporate almost immediately when thrown onto the blaze. They fought the fire as best they could, but the damage was done. By the time the fire finally died down, the barn had been reduced to a smoldering wreck. Almost all of their hay and feed, supplies they desperately needed for the winter, were lost. As they stood amid the smoldering ruins, John's shoulders slumped in defeat. "This can't be happening. We just can't catch a break." Emma stood beside him, her hands on her hips, staring at the charred remains of their hard work. "We'll rebuild," she said quietly, though her voice cracked. "We always do." That night, after the adrenaline had worn off and the silence of the farm had settled in again, Emma and John sat in the kitchen, sharing a pot of tea. The fire, the sickness, the constant fight, it was wearing on them. "You know," John said, looking across the table at Emma, "when we were younger, we had a similar string of bad luck. Remember when the storm took out the roof of the barn, and we had to fix it in the middle of the night?" Emma smiled faintly at the memory. "I remember. We worked together just like we always do. It wasn't easy, but we got through it." John nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I keep thinking that we can't possibly go through this again. I don't know how much more I can take." "We've always made it through," Emma replied gently. "We just need to keep fighting." In the days that followed, the battle to save their animals continued. Though Dr. Carter had been efficient in collecting samples, he seemed to grow more distant, more clinical with each passing day. And then, one afternoon, as they were feeding the animals, John noticed something that gave him hope. One of the cows, an old, gentle creature named Hazel, had begun to eat again. Her coat seemed shinier, and she was standing a little straighter than before. "Look at Hazel," John said, his voice soft with cautious optimism. "She's getting better." But just as quickly as the hope had risen, it was crushed. The next morning, when they went to check on Hazel, they found her lying in the hay, barely breathing. Her once bright eyes were dull, and her body was covered in a cold sweat. "We can't lose her, not now," Emma said, her voice trembling as she knelt beside the cow. They tried everything they could, but it was clear that Hazel's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Within hours, she was gone. The grief that followed was sharp and painful, a cruel reminder of just how fragile life could be on the farm. As they buried Hazel under the old oak tree by the pasture, Emma's eyes wandered to the barn where the fire had been. Something felt wrong. There was a strange smell in the air, faint but unmistakable. It was as if the scent of smoke never truly left. John, sensing the same unease, turned to her. "Do you think it's over? The fire, the sickness? Or is it just the beginning?" Before Emma could respond, her gaze fell on the ground near the barn door. There, etched into the dirt, were strange, unfamiliar footprints, fresh ones. They led into the barn, disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 5. Difficult Decisions. The sound of clanking metal echoed through the early morning air as John tinkered with the new water pump, his hands grease-streaked and tired from hours of failed attempts. The hum of the machine seemed deafening in the silence of the otherwise calm morning. He tightened another bolt, wiped his brow, and pulled on the lever again. Nothing. The water still refused to flow. Emma stood a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest, watching him with a mixture of concern and quiet resignation. For the past few days, John had thrown himself into this problem as if it was the only thing that mattered, ignoring the mounting tension that the water shortage was causing. Their crops were wilting, the animals growing restless, and yet, the pump, this new, expensive piece of equipment, simply wasn't working. "Maybe we're missing something," John muttered, his voice strained. He took another look at the machine, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. It was supposed to be the answer to their water woes, the lifeline they had been hoping for. But nothing was happening. Emma sighed softly, her breath catching in the cool air. "John, maybe it's time to ask for help. You've tried everything you know." John straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need help," he replied, his voice low, almost defensive. "I'll fix it. We've been through worse. This is just another challenge." Emma knew better than to argue further. She had watched him struggle with this stubborn piece of machinery for days, and she could see the toll it was taking on him. His pride was as much a part of him as his calloused hands, and admitting he couldn't solve something on his own was harder for him than anything else. She'd seen it before, in the way he'd fought against asking for help when their barn roof had collapsed years ago. It wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was about holding on to something. His dignity, perhaps, or the belief that he was capable of doing it all himself. But as Emma glanced at the wilting plants in the garden and the parched ground beneath her feet, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep going like this. The longer they waited, the harder it would be to make a comeback. That afternoon, the animals grew more restless. The cows stood in their pens, their heads lowered, staring blankly at the dry ground. The pigs, usually so content to wallow in the mud, now scratched at the dirt, their eyes dull with dehydration. The geese, once so proud and loud, were eerily quiet, huddled together in a corner, their feathers ruffled and unkempt. Emma walked from pen to pen, checking on each animal, trying to mask her growing concern. She stopped at the pigs, gently rubbing the back of the largest one, a boar they called Rufus. His usual boisterous energy had been replaced by a strange lethargy. His skin was dry, and his once shiny coat had lost its luster. "John," Emma called, her voice wavering slightly. "You need to come see this." John had just finished another round of tinkering with the pump, his frustration boiling over as he wiped his brow once again. At her summons, he walked over to the pens, his eyes scanning the animals. His heart sank when he saw Rufus, standing motionless, his eyes dull. "Something's wrong," John said quietly. "This isn't just the water. It's something more." Emma's stomach twisted as she watched her husband's face harden with worry. "I think they're getting worse. Whatever it is, we can't afford to wait much longer." John stood silent for a moment, his hands on his hips, looking down at the animals. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. His pride was a barrier, but it was becoming harder to ignore the fact that they were running out of options. "Maybe we can talk to George and Martha," John muttered under his breath. "They've been doing this longer than us." Emma glanced at him in surprise. "Are you sure?" John's jaw tightened. "I don't want to, but maybe it's time. We can't fix this on our own." The decision hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. John, despite all his pride, knew they couldn't carry on like this, not without risking everything they had. The next morning, John finally made the call. George and Martha were longtime neighbors who had helped them out before, but it had been years since they'd been in touch. John had always prided himself on being independent, and asking for help from anyone, even neighbors, was a blow to his pride. But the situation had become too dire. "Hello." George's voice came through the phone, gruff but kind. "George, it's John," he said, his voice betraying a rare hint of vulnerability. "We're having some trouble with the water system and, well, I could use some advice. I think we might need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then George's voice softened. "We'll be there in a couple of hours, John. Don't worry. You've helped us before. Now it's our turn." By the time George and Martha arrived, the sun was already high in the sky. John met them at the front gate, his face a mixture of relief and embarrassment. George, a stout man with thick hands and a deep laugh, clapped John on the back. "Don't sweat it, John. These things happen to the best of us," George said, his voice warm and reassuring. Martha, her gray hair pulled back into a tidy bun, walked over to Emma, her eyes scanning the fields and the pens. "How are the animals holding up?" she asked gently. Emma sighed. "Not well. We're doing everything we can, but it's getting worse. We're running out of time." Martha nodded knowingly, her face creased with worry. "We'll figure something out. Let's take a look at that water system of yours." As George and John walked toward the pump, Martha and Emma took a quick tour of the farm. Emma watched as Martha examined each of the animals carefully. The cows seemed the worst off, their ribs showing more prominently than they should. Even the chickens were quieter than usual, their feathers looking ragged. "I've seen this before," Martha said after a moment, her eyes serious. "Dehydration is taking a toll. You've got to fix that water problem soon, or things will get a lot worse." The hours that followed were a blur of labor and frustration. George and John worked together to examine the pump, recheck the pipes, and troubleshoot every possible issue. But despite their best efforts, the pump remained stubbornly silent. Nothing changed. As the sun began to set, Emma returned to the house, exhausted. She sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers trailing over a pile of old journals and notebooks that had been left on a shelf for years. One caught her eye, a small, leather-bound book she hadn't opened in ages. It was her old farm journal, the one she had kept when they first started out. Flipping it open, she skimmed through the pages until something caught her attention. In one of the entries, she had detailed a method she had once tried to revive the water supply using an old technique she had read about, something her father had used when they were just getting started. She had written it off as a failure back then, but now, reading it again, it seemed like it could work. She quickly made a note of the steps. "John," she called, rushing to the door. "I think I've found something. It might be the answer." But when she turned to share her discovery, John's face was pale. "It's worse than I thought," he muttered. "We're losing time. If we don't fix this now, we'll lose everything." Chapter 6. A New Chance. The air was thick with tension as John and Emma made their way across the field, their boots heavy in the soft, muddy earth. The search for water had led them to the outskirts of their property, near a small, overgrown ravine. They had heard rumors from a few locals about an old underground vein of water nearby, and John was determined to find it. The problem was that they weren't the only ones searching for this precious resource. As they approached the ravine, John's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of movement, figures working in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a group of farmers or perhaps just some stray animals. But as they got closer, the unmistakable sight of mining equipment came into view. "Those aren't farmers," Emma whispered. her eyes narrowing in suspicion. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The figures weren't just working. They were digging. Deep, heavy machinery was digging into the earth with reckless abandon. He could see them now, the shadowy shapes of men working without regard for the land. "We need to get closer," John murmured. "I want to see what they're up to." Stepping carefully through the dense brush, they crept toward the diggers. When they were close enough to hear the men's voices, John realized what they were doing. These were illegal miners, trying to dig a well deeper than the regulations allowed. It wasn't just about water, it was about digging for profit, tapping into the resources without the permits. They were risking the balance of the land, violating rules that protected the natural ecosystem. "This could ruin everything," John muttered under his breath, clenching his fists. Emma's gaze remained fixed on the men. "We can't let them do this," she said, a quiet determination settling over her. John nodded. "We'll handle it, but not now. Not until we have a plan." Turning back to their own land, John's mind raced. He was no stranger to hard work, but these men had an edge, resources, manpower, and a complete disregard for rules. Yet John wouldn't back down. He refused to let outsiders take away their chances of survival. As they walked back toward the house, Emma's thoughts were elsewhere. The water situation had taken a toll on them both, and their ability to provide for the animals was slipping away. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That evening, as the sun sank low in the sky, Emma sat in their cozy kitchen, flipping through an old book she had found buried in a box of farm journals. It was a manual on herbal remedies and natural treatments for farm animals. Something she'd once relied on in their early days on the farm, but had let slip away in favor of more modern methods. She came across a chapter on remedies for dehydration, something she'd never paid much attention to before. The recipe was simple: herbs and root extracts that could be infused into the animal's water to help them recover from a lack of fluids. It wasn't the solution they needed for the water shortage, but perhaps it could help them survive until they figured out the next step. "Maybe this is the break we need," she muttered to herself, marking the page with a piece of scrap paper. Later that night, while John worked on creating a plan to restore the barn, Emma began gathering the necessary herbs. It was a laborious process, the kind of thing she hadn't done in years. But something about the way the old book spoke to her made her believe it was the right choice. Maybe it wasn't a cure-all, but it could give their animals the boost they needed. As she prepared the concoction, Emma's thoughts turned to the ongoing water crisis. The problem had only grown worse in recent days. The pump had failed them, the miners were dangerously close, and their crops were nearly lost to the drought. But she wasn't ready to surrender. The farm had survived countless hardships before, and this would not be their undoing. While Emma worked, John had begun to develop a plan for restoring the barn. The fire had taken so much from them: crops, supplies, and the stability of their farm. Now, it was a matter of rebuilding what had been lost. He made a list of materials they would need: new timbers, roofing sheets, nails. The task seemed monumental, but John wasn't one to shy away from hard work. The barn was the heart of their farm. Without it, there would be no place for the animals to shelter, and the animals were everything. The morning after, John and Emma tackled their respective tasks. John started organizing the materials they'd need for the barn repair, making calls to neighboring farms for resources they could share. They were a small community, and sometimes the bonds of necessity outweighed pride. Meanwhile, Emma administered the herbal remedy to the animals, hoping the concoction would give them some strength. By midday, they had created a temporary system for collecting rainwater. They had set up makeshift barrels around the house and barn, and although it wasn't the most ideal solution, it would provide them with a source of water until they could fix the pump. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the day drew to a close, John and Emma took a break, sitting together in the fading light on the porch. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was an undeniable tension beneath it. The farm, their livelihood, was hanging by a thread. They both knew it. That night, after finishing their chores and locking up the barn, they went inside to sleep. But their respite was short-lived. In the dead of night, an eerie sound broke the stillness. The screech of metal, followed by what sounded like footsteps on the porch. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She sat up, her breath shallow. "Did you hear that?" John's expression hardened. "I did." The faint creak of a door opening was followed by the sound of movement outside. Someone was out there. "Stay inside," John whispered urgently, getting out of bed. He moved to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing. But the sounds continued, footsteps, something scraping along the side of the barn. "Who's out there?" John called into the night, his voice strong but laced with concern. The sounds stopped abruptly. No response. John turned to Emma, his face pale. "We need to be careful. I don't know what's going on, but I have a bad feeling." End of chapter 6. The eerie noises of the night left John and Emma with an unsettling feeling. Someone, or something, didn't want them to stay on the farm, and the danger they faced was becoming more than just a fight for survival. Chapter 7. Trials. The morning light filtered through the cracked window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor of the farmhouse. It was a quiet, still morning, but Emma could sense the tension in the air. Another day, another problem to face. The water supply was still failing, despite their best efforts. Emma stood in front of the pump, examining the device once again, her brow furrowed. "It's no use," she muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. "We've tried everything." John walked over to her, looking at the pump with equal disappointment. They had replaced parts, fixed leaks, and tried every trick they knew, but nothing had worked. The water simply wouldn't flow, leaving them with no choice but to rely on the rainwater they had been able to catch. But that, too, was running low. "I'll go check the pipes again," John said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "Maybe something else is clogged." Emma nodded, watching him walk off toward the barn. She felt a pang of guilt twist in her chest. They had both been trying so hard, yet it felt like they were running out of time. The animals, their precious animals, were beginning to suffer from the lack of water. The sheep were listless, the pigs sluggish, and the cows seemed to be growing weaker with each passing day. She turned back toward the house, trying to gather her thoughts. They were running out of options. The old methods they had relied on were no longer effective. By the time John returned from the barn, a grim look on his face, Emma knew things had taken a turn for the worse. "The pipes are fine," John said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "It's something deeper. We need to find a new source. I don't know what else to do." As if on cue, Emma heard the frantic squawking of the geese. They ran toward the back of the house where the animals were kept. The sight that greeted them was one they both feared. A sickly-looking duck had fallen over, and several others appeared lethargic and struggling to breathe. Emma's heart sank as she crouched beside the animals. She could feel the heat radiating off them. They were suffering from a fever. "This is bad," she whispered. John kneeled beside her, his face drawn with worry. "We've tried everything, but I don't know if we can save them without proper water. They're dying, Emma." At that moment, the first spark of panic crept into Emma's mind. She wasn't used to feeling helpless, but now, it was as if every effort she had put into caring for this farm was slipping through her fingers. She had to do something. "We can't give up," she said softly, her voice firm. "We'll find a way. We always do." But even as she spoke, she knew the situation was dire. Without water, their animals would continue to suffer. Emma turned and hurried into the house, flipping through her old farm journals. Maybe there was something, some forgotten remedy or solution, hidden in those pages. Meanwhile, John's mind was racing. They couldn't keep going on like this. He thought of their neighbors, but his pride kept him from seeking help. They had always managed on their own. But now, they were faced with a choice. Let the farm collapse or ask for help. Later that afternoon, they were back in the barn when the worst happened. The fire alarm went off, sending both of them into a frantic panic. Smoke was curling out of one of the haylofts, and the heat of the flames soon reached them. Without thinking, John grabbed the nearest bucket of water and tossed it at the fire, but it was too little, too late. Within moments, the entire hayloft was ablaze, the flames licking the walls as they spread quickly. The fire consumed a large portion of their feed, leaving the animals with even less to sustain them. "Not again," Emma said hoarsely, her voice cracking with emotion. "Not after everything we've been through." John, his face ashen, looked at the fire with defeat in his eyes. But then, something clicked. The fire, destructive as it was, had exposed something. Beneath the hayloft, there was an old storage area they had almost forgotten about. "It's the old water tank," John said, his voice suddenly sharp with purpose. "We used to collect water in there. It's buried under the hay." They scrambled toward the storage area, pulling the hay aside, their hands working quickly and desperately. After a few moments, they uncovered the rusty, old tank, covered in dust and debris. "We might be able to fix this," John said, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. Emma nodded, and together they began the task of repairing the tank. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They worked through the night, their hands sore and their minds focused on the goal. By morning, the tank was ready. It wouldn't solve all their problems, but it would give them a temporary source of water. It was a small victory. As Emma and John sat back, exhausted but relieved, they saw a faint glimmer of hope. The tank, though not ideal, had worked. They were able to pump a few gallons of water for the animals. The most immediate problem had been addressed, but the war wasn't over. There was still so much to be done. As they continued to deal with the aftermath of the fire and the growing illness among the animals, they also had to find a better solution for water. They couldn't keep relying on makeshift methods. They needed a long-term plan, one that would ensure their survival through the dry seasons. But just as they were beginning to regain their footing, something else happened. That evening, as they prepared for bed, they heard the sound of footsteps outside. Quiet but deliberate. John's heart stopped. "Who's there?" he called out, stepping outside. The wind had picked up, carrying the unmistakable scent of smoke. But there was something else, something they hadn't expected. The shadow of a figure moved across the yard. End of chapter 7. As the farmstead struggled to recover, the threat of someone or something interfering with their efforts was all too real. John and Emma could no longer ignore the possibility that someone didn't want them to succeed. And now, they would have to face an even greater challenge. Chapter 8. The Dark Night. The sun had barely begun to dip behind the hills when the first signs of trouble emerged again. The day had been filled with heavy silence, as if the very air itself knew that something was coming. Emma walked through the barn, checking on the animals one last time before heading inside to prepare dinner. The pigs were quieter than usual, their usual grunts replaced by low, almost mournful snorts. But it was one of the geese that caught her attention. It had always been one of the more skittish birds, but tonight, something was different. The way it moved, jerky, erratic, wasn't like anything Emma had seen before. She approached cautiously, but the moment she did, the goose flapped its wings wildly and let out a screech. Emma froze. This wasn't normal. "John!" she called out, panic rising in her chest. John hurried into the barn, his face drawn with concern. He had noticed the strange tension in the air as well. "What's wrong with it?" he asked, kneeling next to Emma as she watched the goose thrash around, more violently than she'd ever seen. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice shaky. "But this isn't right." John slowly stood up, his eyes scanning the barn, the animals, and then the ground beneath them. Something felt off, almost as if the animals were under some kind of influence. As he stood, his eyes landed on the hay scattered near the back of the barn. There, among the dry stalks, was something unusual. A small vial, almost hidden under the debris. Emma quickly grabbed it, and the moment her fingers touched the cool glass, a cold shiver ran down her spine. "What is this?" she whispered. John took the vial from her, holding it up to the light. The liquid inside was dark, almost black. It didn't look like any medicine they'd used before. Could it be poison? Emma asked, though the idea sounded too sinister to even voice. John nodded grimly. "It's possible. The animals have been acting strange, and now this, I think someone's been poisoning them." The realization hit hard, colder than any winter chill. Someone, somehow, had been poisoning their livestock. But why? And who would want to destroy everything they'd worked so hard for? Before they could contemplate further, the sound of cracking would pierce the stillness of the night. The barn door shuddered under the pressure of something heavy pushing against it. John and Emma exchanged a quick look, their hearts racing. "Not again," John muttered. "I'll check it out." But before he could reach the door, a sudden burst of smoke erupted from the corner of the barn. The smell of burning wood and chemicals filled the air, and a low, steady hiss followed. The fire was back. "John, we need to get out now," Emma cried, but before they could make it to the door, John spotted something in the distance. A figure. Someone was standing just outside the barn, silhouetted against the flames. Without thinking, John grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her toward the back exit. The flames roared behind them, but the figure remained in place, watching them with eerie calm. "We can't let them get away," John said through gritted teeth, his eyes blazing with fury. "Come on." They rushed through the shadows of the barnyard, past the rows of trees, and out toward the field, where they had spotted the figure. Their footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, but the air was thick with the scent of burning hay and smoke. As they neared the edge of the property, they found themselves in a familiar area, the abandoned shed that hadn't seen any use in years. Emma squinted into the dim light, but the figure was gone. The fire had been extinguishing itself at the barn, but the mystery of the intruder remained. "Who was that?" "John, we need to get back to the house," Emma said, her voice hoarse with worry. Something's wrong. Someone is out there." They made their way cautiously back to the farmhouse, but their fears were far from settled. As soon as they stepped through the door, Emma immediately went to check the animals. The barn had suffered some damage, but they couldn't afford to lose any more. The animals were still restless, more agitated than before, but one by one, they appeared unharmed, at least for now. But as they turned to leave the barn again, a chill ran down Emma's spine. There were footprints in the dirt, small, deliberate steps, leading away from the barn and toward the tree line. Someone had been watching them. "We're not alone," John said, the words falling heavily in the air. "But who's doing this to us?" The night seemed to stretch on endlessly as they scoured the farm, following the trail of footprints that disappeared into the trees. It was quiet, too quiet, and the only sound was the occasional snap of a twig beneath their feet. Finally, they stopped by the old well, half hidden behind overgrown vines. The trail led right to it, as if someone had been waiting there. But there was nothing. The only thing that remained was the deep, unsettling silence. Emma stared at the well for a long moment, her thoughts racing. Was it possible? Could the one responsible for everything have been here, standing right under their noses all along? Before she could speak, John let out a low curse. He'd found something. Near the edge of the well, just out of sight, was a tattered piece of fabric. Emma stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The fabric was torn and frayed, but what stood out was its color. A deep, dark red. The same shade of red as the mysterious liquid they had found in the barn. The realization hit them both at once. This was no accident. Someone was deliberately sabotaging their farm. A sound crackled through the night air, faint and far off, but unmistakable. Someone somewhere was watching them, and they weren't done yet. End of chapter 8. The clues were adding up, and the more Emma and John uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Whoever was behind the attacks was far closer than they had ever imagined, and their next move could be the final one. Chapter 9. An unexpected salvation. The sun had barely risen over the hills when the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel reached Emma and John's ears. The quiet morning, thick with uncertainty, was shattered by the arrival of the veterinarian. The same young man who had seemed out of place on their farm, but was now looking more determined than ever. "Morning," the vet called as he stepped out of his truck, his expression one of quiet resolve. "I know things haven't been easy, but I think I've figured out what's going on." John didn't waste any time. He had his suspicions about the vet's earlier assessments, but right now, they didn't have the luxury of doubt. "What do you think we can do?" The vet opened his bag and started pulling out a new set of supplies. There's a strain of bacteria going around, but I believe with the right treatment, it's not too late for your animals. I've been talking to a colleague, and we have a new kind of antibiotic that could work. Emma looked at him, her face creased with worry, but her hope began to flicker. And you think this will really help them? For all of them? I do, the vet said, with more confidence than they had heard from him before. But it's going to take time. I'll need your full cooperation, and the animals will need to be isolated for a while. John exchanged a look with Emma, both of them silently agreeing that they didn't have much time to waste. Do what you need to do. We'll follow your lead. As the vet worked, Emma and John got to work as well. They moved the animals into separate pens and began the process of administering the treatment the vet had recommended. The entire morning was spent in a whirlwind of activity, cleaning, feeding, and administering the medications. Emma's hands shook as she worked, but she refused to let herself break down. They had been through so much already, and now they had to push through this. By the afternoon, something miraculous began to happen. The ducks, who had been sluggish and weak, started to waddle around again, showing signs of their usual energy. The rabbits, who had been lethargic, perked up, their noses twitching at the scent of fresh hay. It's working, Emma whispered, her voice full of disbelief. It's actually working. John couldn't help but smile for the first time in what felt like forever. Thank goodness, he murmured. But we still have the cows to worry about. The cows were in worse shape than the others. Their legs were weak, and they hadn't been eating properly. The vet had told them that the bacteria had hit them the hardest, and they needed extra attention. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, the vet said, wiping his brow as he finished administering the last dose to a rabbit. We're not out of the woods yet, but I'm optimistic. Keep monitoring them, and make sure you stay on top of their hydration. It was at that moment that Emma had a thought, one that she hadn't fully grasped until now. The water issue had been a silent killer throughout this entire ordeal. Without clean water, the animals' immune systems had been compromised. If they were going to get through this, they needed to fix the water supply once and for all. John, she said suddenly, her voice firm, we need to use the rainwater system. It's the only thing we haven't fully explored yet. John hesitated, thinking back to all the times they had tried and failed to get the rainwater system working. But something in Emma's tone made him pause. She was right. It was their last option. We'll make it work, he said. We have to. Together, they turned their attention to the rainwater system, which had been neglected over the years. It was a series of barrels and pipes that had once caught the runoff from the roof, but it had become clogged with debris. After hours of cleaning and reassembling the system, they finally managed to get the water flowing. I think we've got it, John said, watching the water trickle through the pipes, bringing fresh, clean water into the tank. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The animals would have what they needed, at least for the next few days. As they stood there, catching their breath, a truck pulled up on the gravel road. It wasn't the vet this time. Emma and John looked at each other, puzzled. The new neighbors had arrived. They were a young couple who had moved in just a few miles down the road. The wife, Sarah, stepped out of the truck with a warm smile, while her husband, Tom, followed with a heavy box of supplies. We heard about your troubles, Sarah said kindly, her eyes full of concern. We have some extra feed, and we figured it couldn't hurt to lend a hand. John and Emma were taken aback. It had been a while since anyone had offered help. They hadn't even realized they had neighbors who would care. You're more than welcome to stay for dinner, Emma said, her voice soft with gratitude. We've got a lot to catch up on. Actually, Tom said, we've got a well on our property. We're happy to share it with you, if you need it. And we know a thing or two about the rainwater system. We might be able to help you improve it. For the first time in weeks, Emma and John felt a sense of relief. They weren't in this alone anymore. End of chapter 9. As the water supply finally began to flow again, the arrival of new friends brought hope that things might just turn around. But as the night fell, a familiar unease lingered. The danger of fire still loomed, and the threat of sabotage remained an ever-present shadow. Chapter 10. A Return to Life. The sun rose high over the farm, casting its warm light over a scene that once felt so uncertain. The water flowed freely now, clear and abundant. After so many days of struggle and hardship, the most pressing concern of all had been addressed. The rainwater system, once thought impossible to fix, now operated smoothly, providing enough for both the animals and the garden. John stood at the old pump, watching the water pour from the spout with a feeling of triumph. It had been a long time since he felt this kind of satisfaction and relief. They had finally done it. "Emma, come take a look," John called to her, his voice carrying the weight of years of perseverance. "It's working. We've got it." Emma stepped out of the house, her weathered face lighting up as she approached the pump. She reached out to touch the flowing water, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, her voice filled with a quiet amazement. "It feels like we've been chasing it forever." For a moment, they simply stood there together, watching the water. The farm had been so parched for so long, and now it felt like they were finally breathing again. It was as though the earth itself had breathed a sigh of relief, just as they had. With the water supply restored, the next challenge was watching over their animals. Day by day, they improved. The ducks and rabbits were growing more active, their playful antics returning to the farm. The cows, once so weak and frail, had regained much of their strength. It was as though they had been given a second chance at life, just like the farm itself. "It's working," Emma murmured as she watched the cows graze peacefully. "They're all getting better. Even the ones that were the sickest are showing signs of life again." John smiled, his face softening with relief. "I think we've done it, Emma. We've pulled through." But there was one more thing, one last hurdle they had to face. The fires. They had burned everything in their path. But the last one, the most recent one, hadn't been as devastating as they'd feared. The small shed that had caught fire was quickly extinguished, and although they'd lost some hay and equipment, it hadn't destroyed everything. "Seems like the fire wasn't as bad as we thought," John said as they stood near the remnants of the burned shed, surveying the damage. "The winds weren't as strong last night, and we managed to stop it before it got out of hand." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We've been lucky. Maybe it's a sign that things are turning around for us." "Maybe," John agreed, his voice quiet, "or maybe it's just that we're learning how to fight back." The weeks that followed were filled with recovery. They worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost, patching up fences, replacing hay, and cleaning the barns. Slowly but surely, the farm came back to life, and so did they. John and Emma began to see their lives in a new light. The struggles they had faced, the pain, the exhaustion, they were all part of something bigger now. They had fought for their farm, for their animals, and for each other. And in doing so, they had learned something invaluable. "Do you ever think about all the things we've been through?" Emma asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. "It's like everything we've worked for has led us here, to this moment." "I do," John replied, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "I think about it every day, and I realize that, despite everything, we've come through stronger. I'm proud of what we've built, and of what we've fought for." Emma smiled and took his hand. "We're not done yet, are we?" "No," John said with a chuckle. "Not by a long shot, but maybe we can take a moment to appreciate what we have. For all the work, for all the hard times, we've made it through, and that's something." The final day of the season arrived with a crisp, clear sky. It was a day for gratitude, a day for reflection. John and Emma walked the farm, hand in hand, pausing at each pen, each animal, and each garden plot. They gave thanks for the water that had brought their land back to life, for the animals that had survived, and for the lessons they had learned along the way. "I can't believe how far we've come," Emma said softly as they stood together in the middle of the field. "We've weathered storms, both literal and figurative, and here we are, standing strong." John squeezed her hand, his heart full. "Yes, we have, and no matter what happens next, I know we'll be all right. We've found peace here, and that's something not everyone gets to experience." The wind stirred the trees as they stood in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The farm had found its rhythm again, and so had they. The struggles of the past had faded into memory, leaving only the quiet strength of what they had built together. End of chapter 10. The farm found peace, the animals were healthy, and the struggles they had faced seemed like distant memories. John and Emma knew that their lives, though hard and unpredictable, were a gift. And with each new day, they would continue to care for what they had, for each other, for the farm, and for the animals that had become their family.